I want to say that it's been really wonderful to work with the Anti-Racism Network and specifically Becky Sasakamas-Kuffner and Manuela Valla Castro to create this forum that we'll have the opportunity to learn from today. And I really want to thank Dr. Sheelah McLean and Alicia Buckley and Dr. Sandeep Agrawal for joining us to share the wealth of your knowledge and experience with like a good crowd here in Saskatchewan on super important topics that we so often look for opportunities to come together to talk about. We are very grateful for ongoing support from Sask Lotteries and Sask Culture, and for support for our anti-racism activities in March in commemoration of March 21st, the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, from the Department of Canadian Heritage and the Ministry of Parks, Culture and Sport. So I welcome you to Beyond Diversity and Inclusion, Responsibilities to Address Systemic Racism. I am joining you on this spring day from Treaty 4 in Regina and Western Region 3 of the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan. I am very aware of my my ancestors who came from Eastern Europe looking for a better life and finding that here on Turtle Island. But the ways that they were able to prosper were part of structures that dispossessed Indigenous people of land and economy and ability to live life. And so we come together today at a moment in our history when we're thinking about our relationships and we're thinking about how to create change so that the relationships are good between people who have come here over many generations and people who have lived on these lands since time immemorial. MCoS as a provincial organization is aware that our work and support covers land that is in treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10, and the traditional lands of the Nehewak, Nehenawak, Nehethawak, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, Dene, Anishinaabe, Saulteaux, Nagawe, formerly the Blackfoot peoples here in Treaty 4, who were moved further west as part of colonialism, as well as the Métis Nation, whose contributions to these lands are many. We acknowledge that treaties were made on these lands and that some benefits went to some people far more than others, and that it is our responsibility to be understanding and addressing harms and injustices of ongoing colonialism. We are all treaty people, and I strive to be a good treaty relative. Coming back to here, I just want to take a couple of minutes before we get to what you're really here for as listening to the presenters to talk about, to kind of center this very end of March activity as part of our annual March 21st campaign. March 21st commemorates a horrendous massacre of peaceful anti-apartheid demonstrators in Sharpeville, South Africa in 1960 on March 21st. And in 1966, the United Nations began to commemorate it. It took a while longer for Canada. It's been commemorated here since 1989. And MCoS runs annual campaigns throughout the month of March with public education, often youth leadership workshops, community forums, and support for local events. So we're super pleased to be able to be joining you today with the very last of our activities for 2022. As you would imagine, that the topics that we are discussing, the speakers are sharing from the truth of their experiences and knowledge. Topics that are being discussed may re-stimulate trauma for people, We recognize the need for safety measures to minimize risk associated with this triggering. If you are experiencing distress, or if you do later, as a result of the presentation or other things that you do, please reach out to one of the organizations that are listed below here for support, that they can all either offer support themselves or help connect you to other organizations that can. Sure that most of us are familiar with this by now, but in order to raise and lower your hand to ask a question or make a comment, go to the reactions button on your little Zoom toolbar. It's a little happy face emoji. And then at the bottom, beneath like the list of emojis, there's a little raise hand place. You click on that. Once we call on you, and after you've had a chance to speak, then you can go to the same place and you can click lower hand. We can also always put comments and questions in the chat, and the folks who are here helping out will be watching for those. If you are, when you click on this chat button, it'll open the chat bar usually alongside your screen. And if you're wanting to make sure that everybody sees it, you click on everybody. If you want it to just go to a specific person, you can click on the little arrow and select who it goes to. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Lisa Odell. I'm not introducing Sheelah yet. I'm introducing Lisa Odell, who's MCoS's anti-racism coordinator, and she will be the person doing the introductions to our speakers. Take it away, Lisa.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. I'm so glad you're all here to join us this afternoon. Dr. Sheelah McLean has a PhD in anti-racist education from the University of Saskatchewan and is a third-generation white settler who lives on Cree territory, Treaty 6. Dr. McLean has worked in education for over 30 years, teaching graduate and undergraduate courses for the College of Education at the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. McLean's research and activism focus on using anti-racist theory and praxis in order to address systems of inequality in a colonial context, such as racism, patriarchy, and heteronormativity. She also is a co-founder of Idle No More movement. And I need to just add this, I've learned a lot from her about 2 years ago when the Anti-Racism Network were doing a series of teach-ins in Saskatchewan. Welcome, Dr. McLean.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Thank you for that introduction. And thanks for the invitation. I'm really always honored to be asked to come and share dialogue with everyone. I'm working from home today. So like some of you, I periodically get interruptions, a doorbell ringing or a cat walking across the screen. So I'll apologize in advance. And I just wanted to share a few ideas today that I thought might be helpful for our discussion. You know, this has been a long learning journey for me as well. And I was born and raised here in what is now called Saskatoon. And so most of my work comes from my own realizations of inequality. And I think it would be good to start by thinking about, the session is called Beyond Diversity and Inclusion. And so I think, what are the assumptions behind diversity and inclusion? Because there's a lot of institutions that have campaigns and strategies around diversity and inclusion. And I thought it might be good to think about what are the assumptions there is that if we hire more people that are, Indigenous people, Black people, people of color, that somehow will have resolved the problem of racism in society. We've got institutional racism, systemic racism, and then interpersonal or individual racism, and that this would be resolved. And so I think, it's an assumption that systems are already fair and just, that the way that our institutions work and our systems work are already fair and just, and that what we need is to, add diversity, diverse representation, whether it be racial or gendered or sexual identification, those kinds of things. And then it also makes an assumption that most people are fair and just. And I hear often people say things like, well, I love multiculturalism, or I'm a tolerant person, or, I love learning more about other people's cultures. So it's this idea, and I think particularly here in Canada, there's a lot of dominant narratives across the country about Canada being a place of niceness and innocence. And then that as Canadians, we somehow embody this as white settlers. And I thought, the title of this session this afternoon is so important, because it's saying we need to go beyond diversity and inclusion and really, acknowledge that we live in a society, a colonial society, where institutions have been created on a foundation of inequality, and that we have a long history of race and racism in this country. I think that many Canadians are starting to come to more awareness. And I think it's partly because of social media and mainstream media hurrying to catch up with the information on social media. I think it's the hard work that's been done by BIPOC people to raise awareness of the many things they face in society. And so I do feel like things have been slowly changing over the last 10 years, and I want to talk about that just a little bit. But I would say that in many spaces, and particularly in our institutions, most people believe in this idea of tolerance or fairness, and that, these are issues that don't need to come to the fore. So there's some resistance about talking about anti-racism. There can be some resistance about even acknowledging that racism exists in our institutions or in ourselves. And so I feel like a lot of the work that I've done is trying to understand how racial inequality has been created. Like, what is it that has created the context that we live in today? And how is it maintained? How has that been maintained? And I feel like the answers to those two questions really help us to think about how do we address or intervene in the racism that occurs in ourselves, particularly as white settlers, and then in our institutions, and then, of course, systemically or within the society. And so this is our context of colonialism. And one of the first things, that we do when we're educating on anti-racism is make sure that people really acknowledge and understand the context and how it works, and how we have a very long history of racism and colonialism that has socialized people to think in particular ways. Like, they have a worldview, and they also have ways to think about themselves. And thinking about how Canada is sort of marked and thought of as this fair and multicultural country, something to be celebrated, that we mostly have democracy here, that everybody has benefited from. Those kinds of narratives need to be slowly taken apart, because it really helps us to understand how they are embedded in ourselves, like our own inability to see the context of racism, and particularly as I was growing up. Like, the things that we talk about today are things that I couldn't see growing up, or I think about, is it that I couldn't see them? I could see them, the inequality between myself and, say, Indigenous friends that I went to elementary school and high school. I could see that we were treated differently, but I had racist explanations for those differences that I saw. I was socialized to think a certain way, and it normalized that inequality. in particular, when it comes to normalizing, like what are the stories, what are the narratives that we grow up with that normalizes inequality? And I can give you like a big example, like the, inequitable access people have to clean drinking water, Indigenous people versus non-Indigenous people. And I'll hear stories like, well, they're remote communities, right? Well, there's lots of remote communities that are predominantly white settlers that have access to clean drinking water. So that's not really the issue, like small towns, cities that are very remote, but they have access. So then we have to think about what are the policies and practices that create those inequities, inequitable access to, things that everyone has a right to. And that's part of colonialism. And then I think about what are the narratives that we're told that normalize that inequality so that Canadians don't feel outraged. The majority of Canadians, I want to make that clear. I'm talking about, people aren't pushing politicians to address that, even though that was recently a promise by the Liberal government to address something like access to clean drinking water. And I like to use those examples because it makes it really concrete how racism is a part of the everyday. And I think that meritocracy is it's a narrative that helps to justify the inequality, the inequities that we see in our society. So that if I asked a class of students, what creates poverty? Like, why are people, some communities have less access to things that they need than others? And their answer would be very quick. And I was socialized to think that meritocracy was real as well, because, we think, well, all you have to do is work hard and be smart enough and you can get ahead too. I was taught that. I'm sure I taught my daughters that as well growing up, that it's all about hard work, being smart, having access, knowing what to do, having access to the right things, and then you can get ahead as well. This is a dominant narrative, not just here in Canada, but in the United States and, other colonized spaces as well. And I feel like it is a dominant narrative that is purposeful. Like it plays a role. I think about what do these narratives keep intact and in place? And of course, it erases the inequality that actually occurs. And I want to give you some examples of how I figured out some things about how it actually reproduces itself, inequality, through really thinking about meritocracy, like that it's not just about hard work when we have a long history of inequitable access to the things we need to survive and to thrive. Like we've had hundreds of years of inequitable access based on our racial identity. That's how colonialism works. So my family, who are white settlers, had access to everything they needed to not only survive on the prairies, but to thrive, access to land, access to public education, access to free mobility rights, like we could travel wherever we wanted, access to low-cost loans to be able to grow the farm. My family, they were, Scottish, Swedish, Norwegian ancestry, and they came to farm here in Saskatchewan on the prairies. And they had access to all of the things they needed because the government ensured that they had access to those things. Those things were handed to my grandparents because they were white settlers. They were handed down to my mom and her children, brothers and sisters, and her children eventually, because, she was able to access those same things. To have access is one of the most important things. And I want to make it clear, it's not that my grandparents weren't smart or didn't work hard. Of course they did, but they had access to things on the prairies because they were white settlers and because the government wanted them to farm that Indigenous people did not have. At the very same moment that my grandparents were given land to farm and were given access to voting rights and citizenship and the things they needed to thrive, those things were being taken away from Indigenous people. So at each moment, you can see how the inequities were not only happening for my grandparents and for Indigenous people at the very same time, but how those inequities are passed down generationally as well, so that we can still see that, that my people who are my age have inequitable access to those same things because they weren't handed down to them as they were handed down to me over the last 3 generations. And so meritocracy, while we all need to, do some work and put forward some effort to be able to do well in a society, it's never equitable in a colonial society. It's always inequitable because of the way the policies and practices are created and maintained. And I think the hardest thing for most people will accept that historically there were racist policies and practices, and that, Indigenous people have been impacted by those through colonialism, and that white settlers had access to things that Black people and people of color did not have access to when they first came over. So most people are willing to sort of accept that. I think what's harder sometimes to see is how it continues today. How do those inequitable practices continue today? And I think it's part of going beyond diversity and inclusion is that it's our responsibility to look at the everyday practices, policies, and attitudes in our organizations that are maintaining those same inequitable access, that it's not taking into consideration that we've had 150, 200 years of inequitable access to the things that we need to survive and thrive, and that we have to account for that in our organizations and communities. And I know that today that's not being accounted for. And there's so many discourses that sort of challenge that idea that we need to account for that today, that's absolutely what needs to happen. And I want to say that I feel it can happen much quicker than what I often hear is talked about. Like, this is a long, complex process. I don't feel that that's true. I think that those inequities can be addressed very quickly. What we have to address before they can be addressed very quickly is the attitudes of many settler Canadians, because I feel like that's the thing that is holding up the response to justice. And I just want to sort of leave with a few last thoughts about this is like, it was mentioned in my introduction that I worked in the Idle No More movement, and I continue to organize with Idle No More activists today. And I've learned so much from that journey. And one thing that I know is that Idle No More, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, there have been so many big movements across the continent and beyond that have challenged the things we're talking about today, that have challenged systemic racism, that have challenged colonialism and the inequities that we see in our institutions and communities, and really try to get people to challenge, of course, those attitudes in themselves. And the reason that we're seeing a rise in something like the convoy that went to Ottawa, a rise in, some of the fascism that we see happening here in Canada and across the globe, it's not that it's new. These attitudes aren't new, and some of the practices that are happening around it aren't new. But I do feel that it's a backlash to all the hard work that's being done towards change and to the raising of the public consciousness towards these issues, and particularly systemic racism. I feel like this is people that have benefited from a system of inequality, have benefited from being white settlers for a very long time, and they are saying that they want to hold on to that power, that privilege. They want to hold on to that access that they have to resources, to good treatment when they walk into a store, like all of the things that come with being part of the dominant society. And so they're really fighting for that old world. And I think that old world is slowly being dismantled. And there's so much good work being done, like conversations that we're having, today. But we have to be prepared also for that kind of resistance and be able to be really strategic about moving forward against it, and in spite of it. I think that that's really important. And understanding meritocracy is such a key concept to understanding how inequality continues. And so I would just encourage people to, keep thinking about where is this happening in organizations and in communities? And then how can we be strategic to address it? And I always think that it's very difficult to address these things alone as an individual. It's really important to have a network of people that are addressing it together. So coming together for conversations like this is really key to building that kind of a network. I think I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions or comments, or did you want to wait till all three of us were done and then have a dialogue, Rhonda? I wasn't sure.
You're muted, Rhonda.
You're muted, yeah.
Sometimes clicking doesn't work. I was pretty sure I clicked and then talked. Anyway, we don't want to get into a big conversation right now, but if anyone has a quick comment or question for Sheelah before we go to Alicia, then I think we'd welcome that. Al.
Thanks, Manuela. I was just saying we need to be prepared for the backlash. And I do think we need to be prepared. And I can tell you, when I started this journey of anti-racism and I went back into public education, I was not. I had read about what it might look like, resistance, and I sort of knew the narratives. I knew the patterns of white dominance. I had studied them, but I hadn't experienced them yet. And oh my, it was quite an experience. And so it left me to understand that it's really important to be prepared for that and to know, how to respond to white dominance and white resistance.
For sure. Al has a question.
Yeah, I was wondering, how do you approach people to have them more, I guess, open to the idea of critical thinking so that they are able to understand better the roots of current day racism? Because a lot of times you expect that from people that may not be educated, but yet you see it from people that are very educated, and yet they're still not using critical thinking in addressing those issues. And I'm just like, how do you bring people forward so that they're able to at least address it? Because that's one thing that I've noticed, that the people you expect to be able to understand and to, they're not putting forth any effort.
No, thank you. And you know what? That's an ongoing question. And thank you for your question. And I think we all probably here have asked ourselves that same question, is how do we continue to educate people? And so I want to say two things about this quickly before we move to the next presenter. Is we know that we could push for this in public education, that's really the key. And it should be, students should be learning the topics that we're talking about today from K to 12 and in all of their post-secondary courses. Unfortunately, people aren't trained to do that. So even when we have, the push to do that, I think there's a lot of questions about how. And I feel like our public education systems, that's mostly what I've done my research on in my master's and my dissertation is public education. And I feel like there's such a central spot to reproduce colonialism and to socialize us to have a particular worldview. So we're always going to meet resistance there. And I would put most of my hope, most of my energy into this kind of public education like we're doing today, into social media in the Idle No More movement, which we focused on two things, public education and nonviolent direct action. And that was purposeful, is because we knew that there would be more acceptance to nonviolent direct action if we could educate the public and open people's minds about, rethinking. There's no magic way to get people to rethink. You're going to have a spectrum of people who are, at different places in their learning. I tend to really focus on those people sort of in the middle that are open but they don't have access to the knowledge. They haven't had access to the kind of education that many of us have had in anti-racist education or critical education. And yet they're open enough to want to learn. I think we really need to focus our energies on that, and coming together to support people. And so social media, with all of its, problems, is also a gift that we can come together across spaces to be able to support each other in this work. I really think we can continue to push public education. I know there's some things happening there, but I'll be honest, I'm a bit skeptical. Like, their foundation is to maintain white supremacy, white superiority. And so to change that, I think, is always going to be a bit of a battle, a struggle for pedagogy, as Dr. Cheryl Ward, one of my mentors, explained. And so I like the idea of us continuing to build communities of practice, communities of thinking outside of those systems, but they will affect those systems. Like, I think, the hope, Mohawk policy analyst that I work with by the name of Russ Dibo says, the hope is in the people. And so I think it's the grassroots, everyday people and the youth that are going to be our hope.
I just want to end one more thing, that it just seems that it's so tragic that they spent years and years of education of young people glamorizing colonialism at the expense and the tragedy of First Nations people, when the true history of Canada has never been taught.
No.
It's like because it's something that they don't want to, ruffle those feathers of the people that might be offended, that should be offended,
Yeah. And you could see that in the reactions of many Canadians to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that difference in reactions, because Indigenous people have always known what happened at residential schools, whereas for Canadians, many people felt shocked. And I think seeing so many people out in orange shirts during Canada Day this year, I think gave me a lot of hope that people are starting to understand and see. Like, there were hundreds of thousands of people out in orange shirts protesting Canada Day. So that gave me a lot of hope that there's a shift, there's a shift towards change, but there's still much work to be done, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Dr. McLean, for that insightful presentation. Lots of learning this afternoon. So I also would like to introduce our next presenter, Alicia Buckley. Alicia is a member of the Buffalo River Dene Nation and an urban Indigenous woman. She earned her degree at the University of Saskatchewan in regional and urban planning, and has a passion for engaging the community, building stronger communities, and community development. Not only has Alicia emerged as an anti-racism and anti-oppression practitioner by being inspired by her mother, she is honored to help build the Indigenous profile in Saskatchewan while working alongside the wonderful team at the Aboriginal Friendship Centers of Saskatchewan as the program director for the Center of Indigenous Women, Two-Spirit, and Gender Diversity. While in this role, she worked to gather the voices of Indigenous women, 2S LGBTQ+, in the first Indigenous Women's Economic Framework, now being implemented. Being humbled by the voices of Saskatchewan's Indigenous women, 2S LGBTQ+, and communities, she hopes to engage with those across Turtle Island on issues related to urban Indigenous people through AFCS and other volunteer opportunities associated. Please welcome Alicia Buckley. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so my name is Alicia Buckley. My pronouns are she and her, and I am honored to be here. I want to thank our elder for grounding us and reminding us how our relations, we need to address that. So I just want to share, I am a daughter of Treaty 6 and Treaty 10. But I'm also an urban Indigenous woman, so I've never actually been to my reserve, and so I'll get into it a little bit, but that's what our friendship centers serve. I would like to start by just sharing that I am in Saskatoon, so Treaty 6 and the homeland of the Métis. And I want to share why we actually, a little bit of why I was reminded why we do land acknowledgements. So I have a 3-year-old daughter. She was just starting to learn to walk and talk and do all her crazy things. And so one day she, after dinner, we were living with my mom, my husband, and myself, and she went around and tickled everyone. She tickled grandma, she tickled daddy, she tickled me, and then she went and tickled her water and then tickled her cookie. And it instantly dawned on me that she already knew that these things are alive. She already knew that we are all connected and that she needed to be able to address them just as she would anybody else. In her innocent mind, that's something that she sees every day. But yet we need to be reminded as adults that this is something that we need to every time we go and see somebody, we shake their hand, give them hugs, say hi. It's the very same thing. So we need to acknowledge that we're all related to each other. We're related to the land, to the Mother Earth, to Turtle Island, even to that stupid little cookie that she was tickling and all the ingredients that were living and that she went into doing that. So again, I just want to say, welcome to Turtle Island. With that, I am going to share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. Perfect. Okay. So a little bit about who is AFCS. So as Lisa mentioned, I work for the Aboriginal Friendship Centers of Saskatchewan. Most of my colleagues are on the call, so shout out to them. We are a provincial territorial association of the 10 friendship centers across Saskatchewan. So our aims and objectives are there, but we essentially promote, represent, and advocate for not only our friendship centers, but for all urban Indigenous people in Saskatchewan. We operate in a nonpartisan, status-blind world. That means you could be status, non-status, Métis, Inuit, people who have been lost to their culture due to trauma or colonialism or intergenerational trauma, such as myself, or people that are made Saskatoon or our other communities home. We are open to all people, and I really welcome you to go introduce yourself at your local friendship center. We're also a part of a national network of over 130 friendship centers across Canada. So we are here to discuss systemic racism and how to address it. I'm not only going to talk about the systemic racism, but I'm also going to talk about the systemic barriers in general. With the work we do at AFCS, there have been some projects that confirm what we already know. Racism exists, it's in all its forms, and that's specifically to Indigenous women and to us LGBTQ+. Racism, along with other forms of discrimination, is the #1 barrier to these people. We learned that through our project called We All Belong, and that we asked what racism is and at different levels, while we also did anti-discrimination response training. So as you can see, most people are on the lower end of the scale at home and among friends. The average there was 3.22 and 3.57. And then as you see, it gradually worsens the bigger you get in scale, with obviously Saskatchewan, I'm not gonna say obviously, but Saskatchewan being the most racist. Now, I'm just going to point out that this may mean that most people do not know their own biases and that do not intend to be racist. So when we look at what this actually means, and we see that in Saskatchewan, we are the most racist, you might want to question and see what our own biases are. So this is really what I wanted to speak to you about today. One of our projects is called Honoring Her Spark. We have created the first Indigenous women's economic framework. though it is much more than just an economic framework. It's a culturally relevant, holistic way at identifying barriers and needs and being responsible for systemic realities Indigenous women and 2S LGBTQ+ face. We also know that even though this framework focuses on Indigenous women and those who identify as women or gender diverse, it ripples out to the community members and grows to create a safe and healthy communities that benefit us all. This document may be the work of AFCS, but it is the voice of Indigenous women and 2S LGBTQ+. We did a lot of community engagement to gather the stories and better understand how to address systemic barriers, what needs are to be put into place to create success, and what are ways or paths to move forward that we can address these issues together. We included a vision, values that lead the project, as well as the needs and barriers that were shared with us, suggestions moving forward, and developed further ways of addressing needs and barriers to develop a positive economic landscape for individuals, organizations, sectors that are also cross-referenced with the calls to action, calls for justice, and UNDRIP articles. So the framework is pretty self-explanatory. There are 3 parts there, and this is the framework within the document. First, you'll see that there's individual action. Having us identify our own needs, our own barriers, and using what we call personal medicine wheel. The second is to bring women together from all walks of life to really support each other. We call them Indigenous Women's Coalitions, but at the Front of Center level or at the community level, they're women's circles or women's support circles, however you want to look at it. And the third is to really build relationship, and that's the implementation that we're into now. So we provide supports to advocate based on doing engagement and policy workshops that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. So I want to bring to your attention that we are working to empower Indigenous women and gender diverse people, but we focus on economics. We need to dive into what that actually means in everyday context. The definition of economic security and prosperity is essentially that security is the ability to provide for you and your family in a happy and healthy way. Prosperity is to be able to give back to your community and give back to those who have the same opportunity. Most of us are in the prosperity spectrum, meaning that we have that responsibility, again, to empower others and to ensure the same opportunities are provided to others that we already have. So I want to get into a little bit of what we heard and what was gifted to us through the knowledge. This is a list of 20 barriers that are prevalent, 20 categories of barriers that are prevalent to Indigenous women, to us LGBTQ+. The majority of these are systemic, structural, or institutional. And as you can see, discrimination is the top barrier. And of that, racism followed by sexism are the 2 biggest barriers. I'm not going to go through each one of them, but if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. So we heard some different needs, and this is just the top 5 in every area. We use the Aboriginal Life Promotion Framework created by Dr. Judith Bartlett from the University of Manitoba. This adaptation of the medicine wheel is a way of viewing what you need as Indigenous women, using different areas that need to be balanced with each other. So to share a little bit, support is the #1 need. Realizing that need change day to day, even hour to hour. We need to be flexible in providing that support. And that support looks different to different people. We can see that some of the needs can really be addressed by addressing systemic barriers. For example, culturally relevant reporting. As an Indigenous organization, we apply and are successful for many grants and other types of funding. Now, in trying to do that reporting, we also see that the reporting needs to be inclusive, not only First Nation, but Métis, Inuit, even urban Indigenous people. We need to have that flexibility in how we report. Traditionally, as Indigenous people, traditional oral histories are what's passed down. So providing a filled out report is not always easy for those that do not have the capacity. Another example is providing women in leadership. So I know we were just actually talking a bit about the education and what does that look like and how do we keep moving that forward. As part of that piece, you'll see actually is in the political sphere is the voice. How do we ensure that voice is carried? We need to be able to give that voice and that education to those who traditionally don't have that voice. So that's what my job is. Some of the suggestions we heard, and you can see the top 10 there. There's actually a list of 91 in the document, but we cross-referenced all of these to the calls to action, calls for justice, and UNDRIP articles. So an example of life skills workshop is that even talking today about the education that we need to provide ourselves. We see things through social media, we see things through webinars and things such as this, but we need to continue that education. Another one that I could maybe just touch on is the employment opportunities. And I know Dr. Sheelah McLean was just explaining that being able to hire Indigenous people or people of color or Black or women is always a good step. But realizing that that's not always the case. It might be the person that may not have all the book smarts, may not all have all the street smarts to fill that position. So really start looking and thinking holistically on what that position entails, what are things that you need, and really start considering other options and opportunities. So we also have a section called Moving Forward, and this is what really ties everything together. You can move forward as an individual. You can move forward as a group of Indigenous women or a group, a small community of practice. You can move forward as a service provider or organization. You can even move forward as a sector. So the first circle there is just some ideas of how you can move forward as an individual. Something as simple as trying something new. What does it look like to learn about yourself? And then you'll see the other circle there is the sectors that we have categorized. So as part of the work that we do, we've created the Honoring Her Spark workshop. And we really want to bring to light that this is something that we use in a culturally relevant, gender-based, holistic approach. We come together with organizations, with businesses, hopefully with some of you on the call, to go through a workshop. Once we gather information about you and your organization, we can help provide some recommendations through the workshop as to how to address systemic barriers. We use an Indigenous women's lens, and we also map out things almost like strategic planning, where we map out how we can support and honor the calls to action, calls for justice, and UNDRIP articles. I'm not going to really get into it, but if you have time and you're listening, I'm going to share some steps with you to do a personal medicine wheel. So what is that Indigenous women's lens? So if you have a piece of paper in front of you, what you can do is draw a giant X right in the middle. And in that X, you can put a little circle. So what you're going to do is, we're always going to start with the rising of the sun. So we're going to start in the cultural area. What are things that are going well in this area for you? Just jot them down. It doesn't have to be much. And then when you're done that, you can move into the social and the physical and the intellectual. So again, just jot down what's going well in this area for you. And I know that probably some of you are doing it, but you don't have to. The other part of it is actually looking at what's challenging for you. Now, it's a lot easier to think of things that are challenging. That's just our pessimism as human beings. So I want to start off doing what's well. And once you've done your medicine wheel, you can really see, what do you notice? Look at things that are in balance. What are things that are going, some things may be going really well for you. I know during COVID, a lot of the social aspects were challenging for most people. So that might be a little out of balance. But the thing is how do we ensure the balance? So if you imagine a child's top, when you spin it, it's in perfect balance. That's what we're always trying to achieve. But as soon as something gets a little heavier, it starts toppling over. So how do we create that space? But in the next step of this exercise is looking at a lineal way. So not only are you looking in a holistic sense, we're going to walk in two worlds and look at the linear space. So looking at your medicine wheel, you can see where things have gaps. Where are things that you would like to see moving forward? And so being able to put things into a goal setting exercise like this, you're able to kind of see what are things that you want to continue doing well? What are things that you would like to move forward? So an example that I had done is that I really have great employment. So in my intellectual sphere, I have employment. I love the things that I do. I love the team that I work with. But I still need to continue to feed my brain. I need that education piece. And so we've actually developed or started to do a Cree language class with our team. So in the next 2 years, I'm really hoping that I can start speaking this language. And maybe in the next 2 to 4 years, I can become fluent. What does that actually look like? So when we're talking Cree, I can say things, I can provide land acknowledgements, be able to speak with others. But maybe in the next 5 years, I can master this language and help teach others, especially my daughter. So now that you kind of thought about this as a personal thing, this is what I want you to think about as an organization or even as a sector. Go through the Aboriginal Life Promotion Framework that I shared with you before and look at this through your organization. What are things that you're doing? What are things that your policies are saying? What are things that you know that the initiatives and things are being brought to life, and see where your gaps are. We did it with AFCS, and this was our messy wheel. And it was really interesting to see that in our child space, in our spiritual space, it wasn't being fed enough. So how do we create this? What are things that we wanted to move forward? One thing that we're actually implementing is that we really want to start recognizing the people who are in the Friendship Center movement. So we want to recognize long service. We want to recognize people who have done big impacts. So those are some of the things that have come out of it. And that's where we're actually moving towards in that goal setting space, is how do we move this forward together? Now, here are some other ways to address systemic barriers. So remember when I shared how to move forward as an organization, there's two things in there. One is an imperative to read and adopt the calls to action, calls for justice, and UNDRIP articles. Develop a plan on how you can honor these imperatives. Also look at safety. Now, safety in a holistic way. Use that medicine wheel. Use that Indigenous women's lens. Define what that means in safety. Build and implement a safety plan for you as a person, for your family, for your organization, maybe even your sectors. If you're a nonprofit and you have members, if you're a service provider and you have clients, think about safety in a holistic space. Another one that I'd like to share is addressing systemic barriers is by understanding the needs and barriers of all individuals. So as much as we're talking about the system and big things, we need to start looking at that grassroots, look at individuals. What do we need to help provide support and flexibility for them to succeed? Keep in mind that there is always accountability measures to include, and that put this way of thinking into policy and practice. Of course, we're happy to go through the workshop, Honoring Her Spark workshop with you, and look at your policies, maybe perhaps even help revise your policies and see if they're inclusive. Are they inclusive of all genders, all cultures, faiths, social classes, economic classes, educational attainment, abilities, age, so on. Another one, of course, we've already talked about is educating yourself. Educate yourself, your team, your family, your partner, your organization. One of the issues is the access to education and capacity. Now, imagine if everyone had the same access to education. The system would change dramatically. Another point I'd like to make is that look at your own reconciliation journey. Most people associate reconciliation with Orange Shirt Day, with the calls to action, but there's so many additional aspects to think about. Use the Indigenous women's lens and gender diverse lens and think outside the box. How does this connect with everything else? Use that land acknowledgement. How do I relate to this? Reconciliation is about building relationships, but look at what relationships need to be built. And my last point there is about addressing racism. So I mentioned before in the We All Roll Along project that AFCS provided the anti-discrimination response training. We also did it with the Anti-Racism Network. And it was so impactful to see how people can start opening up their eyes and use an active witnessing approach. So most people freeze when they see racism or see discriminatory things happen or verb things mentioned. And so using this active witnessing approach, you start learning about how do I become reactionary? What are things that I need to do to stay on my feet? A prime example is what happened last week. I was at a medical clinic with my grandma, and this family, Indigenous family, came in. It started snowing. It was cold. The waiting room was full, but they hadn't been taking people to the exam rooms. And so when the person said, "Oh, can you please just wait in your car?" The receptionist, she was okay to go ahead with her two young children. But the receptionist then said, "Do you even have a car?" And so that instant thought of systemic barriers and systemic racism happened. Using my active witnessing approach and anti-discrimination response training, I stood up and said, "This is not okay." I was able to stick on my feet. At that time, I addressed the concern that happened, but then I also went back and wrote a letter to the main doctor, so the one who has the medical practice. And so now things are being changed. He's actually going to be looking at how his policies need to be changed to address these issues. And so with that, I just want to say thank you for listening to me ramble. There is a reason why Friendship Center is in our name. We want to build a relationship. We want to work with you, not for you. So I really feel free to reach out to me. We want to be friends. Let's build that relationship, work on a reconciliation journey together. And of course, I welcome any comments, questions, queries, quibbles, quandaries, whatever you may have.
Alicia, we have a quick and simple question to start. Would you be able to share your presentation so we could send it to everybody who's part of this?
100%.
Awesome. Cool. Any other quick questions before we go to our next presenter? We will have time for some more fulsome discussion at the end, but is there another quick question for Alicia before we move there?
What I can do is actually put my contact information in the chat as well. But yes, I'll forward the presentation.
I thought, Lisa, you can take it back and, okay, I'm having trouble. Yunjin?
Hi, how are you? Hi, thank you so much, Alicia. That was very helpful. I have a question. I often, as a minority in Saskatchewan, I often experience that people, they deny that racism is here. How do you deal with that? I mean, it's obviously there, and I'm an art therapist, and I'm just going to the classroom and doing some group art, and they're actually mocking at me with hing hing hong hong sound, like possibly Chinese. I'm experiencing that not just once, right? And they're just denying that. Then how do you deal with that?
So using actually the active witnessing approach, you can really start addressing what those concerns are. Most people don't even know that they're denying racism exists. So really providing that education to them and kind of catching them in the spot. So there's 11 different ways of addressing that. But being honest, sometimes people really don't care. My own personal family, my mom's side of the family, she's German and Polish, and we always have to remind that side of my family that you're being racist. You need to stop. And so they clearly don't believe it's real. They clearly think that I'm insane. And so sometimes you can't get through those people. But on the other hand, sometimes my small impacts, like my husband, he's totally against taxi drivers and blatant reasons of being racist. Now he's actually coming around to, well, maybe it's not the driver itself. Maybe it's the system behind it. So, I mean, it's taken 15 years, probably take another 15 years with him, but there's always change. Change is small and change is continuous.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Alicia. I so appreciated that presentation. Clear, good action ideas, good things that we can move forward with. And now we will present Dr. Sandeep Agrawal. He's a professor, he's a professor and inaugural director of the School of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Alberta. His most recent research has focused on human rights and Indigenous rights as they relate to housing, homelessness issues, municipal restructuring, and international development works in countries like India, Sri Lanka, Brazil, and United Arab Emirates. As an accomplished author with over 100 articles and professional reports and a book, Dr. Agrawal has also contributed to planning practice and affected city bylaws and planning policies and legislation with a lens on human rights and equity. He is the recipient of the Canadian Institute of Planners National Academic Award for his significant contribution to planning, education, and research in the country. Please welcome Sandeep Agrawal. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Lisa. I wanted to share my screen. You see the slide, Lisa? All good? No notes? See? Okay, excellent. I'm always afraid of that. Thank you very much, Lisa, for that introduction. And I just wanted to start off by saying that I'm speaking from Edmonton, Alberta. So I am on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. Thank you to the Multicultural Council of Saskatchewan for the invitation, and thank you to Becky Saskamoose-Kuffner for making the connection. Just wanted to say that I was a bit confused between Mountain Standard Time and Central Standard Time. So I have been waiting for this since my 1 o'clock and perhaps your 1 o'clock as well. But anyways, I'm here, I'm all good to go. So I wanted to talk about human rights and equity and how they intersect with city policies and bylaws. So perhaps a little bit of different presentation than the previous two. And essentially, I want to focus on how city policies can perpetuate systemic racism in terms of where people live, where they work, where they play, and then sort of some ideas about how we can make our cities more inclusive. So I'm going to just say a few, maybe a bit of a self-promotion here, but give you a bit of a context. And Alicia mentioned about taxi drivers. So my foray into human rights actually started with this issue in the city of Toronto, which was to do with city taxi cab drivers. And I was a sort of expert witness at the Human Rights Tribunal in Ontario. And from there on, the next project that I was involved with was to do with cities' zoning bylaw. And I'll talk about that, what zoning bylaw is, again, without getting too much deep into it. But the project that I was involved with in Ontario led to some significant changes, legislative changes in Ontario. Ontario's zoning bylaw was changed. But I think that the big takeaway from here is that Ontario may now be the only jurisdiction in North America where municipalities have to adhere to, it's mandated that they adhere to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Ontario Human Rights Code. And it is there in the provincial policy statement, and that has come from the work that I did back in 2013-14. And since then, the work continued, and some of what I'm going to present is our work, which is pan-Canadian, and the work that is recently I did for the city of Edmonton. And there is again a book that was included in the brochure, Rights in the City, which is going to be coming out fairly soon, talks about human rights, Indigenous rights, and all other different kinds of rights that, that we know of. Okay, so I want to just touch upon this term zoning bylaw that may or may not be familiar with the audience, but zoning is essentially a tool that municipalities use to do land use planning, and it has been employed to address conflicts between various land uses, residential, industrial, commercial, and so on. And it has been used for more than 100 years. So basically what zoning does is it sets rules where new buildings should go, what type of buildings they can be, what type of activities and businesses can happen there. So for instance, it may be nice to have two houses next to each other that look pretty similar, and perhaps not a good idea to have a factory next door. So zoning then sort of comes into picture and puts those kind of uses separately. It also controls, as I mentioned, the height, size, location, and where people live, residential, industrial, commercial, and whether it's okay to have a religious building or a daycare in a residential zone, right? So those are the kind of things that zoning begins to determine. So there is a purpose. It sets an order, helps in balancing growth of some sort, but it has been used historically and to some extent even now to control and segregate specific communities based on their income or racial background. So zoning has a dual legacy, I would say. One is to promote the public good, and then it also has enabled discrimination and exclusion in cities, and even here, cities in Canada. I wanted to touch upon some of the historical sort of discriminatory practices at the local level, because I think it's important to know what has happened in the past and where we are today. We all know the history. Canada has had a checkered history on the rights fronts and how racist Canada used to be back then, especially against people of Chinese descent, Japanese Canadians during the Second World War, Indigenous peoples through the Indian Act. So, Canadian society back then was embedded with all kinds of discrimination, racism, sexism, ableism, xenophobia. So what we have done is we have actually, so this is a chapter in that book where we have looked at the case law related to municipalities the last 150 years and how people of color and Indigenous people, how they were dealt with at the municipal level in cities in Canada. So there are these 5 sort of themes that emerge as to what happened at the city level, at the municipal level. So the first one is racial restrictive covenant. So basically it's an agreement between, among or between owners of adjoining properties where they can legally bind each other as to, who the property could be sold to or rented to. And by racial if you attach the racial component, essentially they can bind each other that the properties could only be rented to or sold to members of certain races, or cannot be sold to or rent to certain races. So Jewish people, again, this is back in the history, Jewish people in particular, people of color, have been discriminated through these covenants. And they were legal till 1940s, 50s. In Alberta, they were legal till early 1970s, and hut rights were the ones who sort of took the brunt of it all. Women were excluded from any form of political participation at the local level. They were considered inferior to that of men, even though they owned property in a municipality. The third theme that comes out quite often is to do with the freedom of speech and religion and assembly, and how they were dealt with, again, in the cities. And this goes back to 1937. It's to do with Quebec. There was a law called the Padlock Law. And essentially the idea behind that law was to prevent any dissemination of communist propaganda of some sort. So it basically allowed local authorities to close any buildings suspected of being used for any communist activity. So the case law around that, how the appellant was arrested because he or she actually flouted the Quebec City's municipal bylaw, and that so there's a whole history around how the freedom of speech and religion assembly were infringed back then. In Edmonton, there were city ordinances that prohibited Black people from using public amenities. Businesses could refuse to serve Blacks. We know all about Chinese head tax. In fact, in British Columbia, in municipalities, there was restrictions on the type of business licenses that could be issued to, especially for people of Chinese descent. Now, what is most interesting, the last part is restrictions on Indigenous people. When we looked at the case law of last 150 years, we did not find a single case that was related to Indigenous people. And we began to take a deep dive, and what we found was some very interesting factors that were contributing to it. One was the assimilation policy. And essentially what it did was it actually confined Indigenous peoples to reserves. Because if they had left the reserve, they would have lost their Indian status. So there were very few or no Indigenous people living in Canadian cities at that time. Reserves were managed by the band government, not municipal government, which reported to the federal government. And the third part is very important. If Indigenous peoples had any issue, any legal issue, they were barred from hiring lawyers or seeking legal advice. You see, these were the factors that were contributing to the fact that there is absolutely no legal case. There is no case law that is about Indigenous people who were facing issues at the local level. So where are we today? So this was the history, and this is, I'm talking about now. I think we have made progress. So I'm sort of going to leave you with some positive notes here. I think Canada is attempting and has made strides in safeguarding what I call as rights in the city to its citizens. And essentially by rights in the city, I mean is a bundle of human rights, so property rights and all other kinds of rights that fall under the rubric of human rights. So that's one. The Canadian judiciary has expanded the scope of rights. And I'll talk about these in my next slides. The third point is very important. Rights in the city is an ongoing pursuit. That means we haven't solved all the problems, right? Not everything is hunky-dory. The struggle continues despite having the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and human rights and all other kinds of rights that now each one of us has. The last one I would say is about the idea of human rights, how it varies across the country, from individual rights to collective rights. Collective rights, by that I mean rights held by Indigenous peoples. And there is a tension between individual rights and collective rights. And I'll talk about that briefly in my next slides as well. So when we talk about significant progress, and there's a whole list of things here, and I will not go through all of them, but a few things are important to note. If you look at Ontario, Ontario has revised its legislation to align with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Ontario provides legal aid to those who have experienced discrimination. That doesn't mean that everybody gets the legal aid. It's the cases which are important to the government and its society at large. They now have new provincial legislation as well as local bylaws. They call inclusive housing, inclusive zoning. It's a way to provide affordable housing. Alberta now expressly prohibits discrimination based on age, sexual orientation, and gender identity, which wasn't included before. Municipally, Winnipeg, Toronto, municipal councils reveal new awareness of the primacy of human rights issues in making decisions. Municipalities have changed their bylaws as well to allow more supportive housing, remove restrictions on their locations and such. So I think some progress has been made. Montreal is a very good example. They have something called Charter of Rights and Responsibilities that leads to the creation of the Ombudsman's Office. So basically in Montreal, if any Montrealer who feels that he or she is not treated fairly by the city, they can approach the Office of Ombudsman and ask for a remedy to their issue. BC provincial government had passed very recently the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, and that allows more rights to Indigenous people in BC. Now to my second point, this is about the Canadian judiciary. And I would submit to you is that Canadian judiciary has expanded the scope, interpretation, and application of charter rights. If you go back, and again, I have looked at the legal cases, if you go back to early 90s, most of the cases at the municipal level were decided on one section of the charter, which was section 15. Today, more and more cases are decided based on multiple sections. Section 2, which is all about fundamental freedoms, whether it's about freedom of consciousness and religion and so on and so forth. But most importantly, it's about section 7, which is the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. So again, not going into too much of details here, there have been cases where court has intervened and has quashed a municipal bylaw that only allowed a family member to occupy a secondary suite. There have been cases around infringement on the freedom to practice religion, mostly to do with Quebec. There was a issue of freedom of expression that appeared in several cities actually lately, in which the cities removed an advertisement that made explicit references to the honor killings of Muslim girls. And the cities removed those posters from their properties. And then the sponsor of this advertisement sued these cities, and court actually ruled in the favor of these cities and agreed with the removal of such an advertisement. Now, the problem I think is about the last part, which is housing and homelessness, which we know and we experience in almost all of our cities in Canada. There has been a judicial reluctance and legislative silence on housing issue. Few cases have come up that are quite interesting. For instance, there was a case in the city of Abbotsford where the court actually said that the homeless people have a constitutional right under Section 7 of the Charter to erect temporary shelter or sleep overnight in parks. So, they could pitch their tents and such. But what the court did not do, it did not impose positive obligations on the government to fix the homelessness problem. They only said, okay, well, yeah, sure. If you don't have housing, go ahead and use the parks. Now, we know that the federal government is moving, has announced this human rights-based national housing strategy. But again, I don't know how far it's going to go, because I think it probably required some constitutional amendment, which we know is very, very complex. Okay, now, remember I said it's not all hunky-dory. There are tons and tons of issues. So we have looked at about 70 or so cities, from large to medium to small, across the entire country. The colors represent which issues are common, and you can see housing and homelessness appear. The yellow ones appear in almost every province. Accessibility, that means about physical, accessibility to transportation system, transit stations, and things like that. They appear quite a bit, and they are in green color. Freedom of expression in the public spaces has come up quite a bit. Freedom of religion, which is more to do with Quebec at this point of time. Opposition to places of worship like mosques and Jewish synagogues and such. Indigenous issues. Now, this is a bit of a murky area from legal perspective in terms of what is the role of municipalities in order to have respect the Aboriginal and treaty rights, duty to consult, because at the moment it seems to just lie at the federal level and the provincial level. Down to Saskatchewan, I just wanted to make a point that in our study, we included Saskatoon, Regina, Prince Albert, and Moose Jaw. One thing I wanted to point out about Saskatchewan is access to justice. Access to human rights justice is a key issue in Saskatchewan. There is no human rights tribunal. It only has Human Rights Commission, which does not adjudicate on human rights matter. So if anyone has a complaint based on human rights, they have to go to a regular court, which, as you know, costs a whole lot of money than a human rights tribunal would. So this is actually a serious issue when it comes to Saskatchewan. Okay, I'm going to just run through this quite quickly. This is the report that we did for the City of Edmonton, a lot to do with the bylaw, city bylaw. We came up with a lot of issues. They were to do with inequity in terms of people of color. So this is the case now, right? Remember what I mentioned in the slide earlier was about 40s and 1940s and 50s, but we see issues even now, issues related to barriers to Indigenous ways of appropriating spaces, procedural issues, NIMBYism, the issues around where people can live. There are, what City of Edmonton has done, it has created zones in such a way that a large swath of the city is only meant for single detached homes. So what that means is, if you are of a lower income, can afford only townhouses and such, you just cannot live on almost 70% of the City of Edmonton. So there are those issues that we elicited for the City of Edmonton, and they're actually changing. So the new zoning bylaw that's coming up will address some of these issues. So this is my last slide, just a few words to capture all what I have said. We know that Canada has had an uneven history on the rights front, but it is making progress, and I think we need to acknowledge that. Canadian judiciary has expanded the scope of rights. Rights in the city is an ongoing pursuit. We haven't solved all the problems. As I mentioned before, tension between individual and collective rights still remains. Zoning has the capacity, it has a limited capacity to propagate equity in every sphere of city residents' lives. So what that means is that the system needs to, the city's operation, city's policies, processes all have to be taken into account, not just the zoning, to make sure that our cities are inclusive in nature. So nonetheless, it is our legal and moral responsibility to ensure that any planning instrument, including zoning, is free of any discriminatory elements. So this is my last slide, and thank you very much for listening. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Sandeep. That was really, there's lots packed into there. There's also, not surprisingly, there's been a request for your presentation, if you'd be willing to send us those slides as well then. And Alicia, I noticed that you put them into the chat. If you could send them to us, then we can just make sure we send them out to everybody. Very much appreciated. Thank you so much. And yes, as we said, now we'll open it up to questions, both for Dr. Agrawal, but also for any of the other panelists, or questions that simply open discussion for everyone. I'm going to switch to gallery. And you can ask questions either with a hand up, or if you'd rather just put it in the chat, put it there, and you can pose them to one of our speakers or to multiple. And maybe while everyone's thinking, because I know it takes so much courage to be the first, some of our thinking about systemic racism as clearly a very complex phenomenon. It's intertwined and perpetuated within government structures at all levels, municipal, provincial, and federal, as well as in private and community sectors. So I would pose this to any of our speakers. We see that sometimes confusion or battles about jurisdiction can delay or prevent change to oppressive systems. Do you have any suggestions about how to navigate identifying and changing policies when there are multiple systems or levels of government involved?
Maybe I can start. So that's actually one of our recommendations moving forward, is what are jurisdictions and what do those actually mean? I don't know if any of you are familiar with L'Orange, but it's actually pretty insane that one house is actually on reserve, one house is off reserve, one house is on reserve, one house is off reserve. So you can be in the same neighborhood and half of you get health or education rights, half of you don't. Even in the same family, there's so many issues with some of the children. So a mom can have 4 children. Some of them have status, some of them don't have status. So what are those issues? So we see that we need to blur those jurisdictional lines. How do we partner? How do we work together with different service providers, organizations, using that community-centric approach? Because we notice all the time that there's always things missed out. And that's where like Jordan's principle comes in, where there's so many issues that happen because we're not blurring those lines. Health, safety, education, all that has to come forward first.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to respond to that? Or I see Terry has her hand up, but if Sheelah or Sandeep, yeah, go ahead, please.
Just, I'm just going to add to what Alicia said, that and again, as an urban planner, I deal mostly with municipalities, and municipalities are, as we all know, creatures of their provinces. So there are limitations in terms of what municipalities can do. But when we speak of human rights, I think it involves federal government, provincial government, and municipal government. The problem, as I mentioned earlier, is the role of municipalities in terms of their authorities and jurisdictions vis-a-vis human rights, as well as Indigenous rights. And that is not very clear And it could only be made clear by individual provinces sort of putting clear guidelines out. Some have done that, but again, they are still kind of just guidelines. So essentially, it allows anything to happen within that. BC is, I think, making more progress than the rest of the provinces. But you're absolutely correct. All three levels of government must work together to solve these problems, because they're much deeper than some of the other problems that we think of, especially housing and homelessness.
Thank you. Sheelah, did you want to add anything?
Maybe just one quick thought, which is, Sandeep talked about the limitations, and I feel like most of us are going to come across barriers or limitations as we're working towards change. And I guess what I've learned over the last 20 years is that one of the most effective ways that we can provide change in institutions is to work from the outside and the inside. So there can be people inside the organization and institution working on new policy, new practices, education strategies, those kinds of things. And I think it can come from the grassroots up, or it can come from the top down, either way. But I think it needs to, usually be led by people within the organization. But I think you also need a strong community who's pushing from the outside, because people from the inside are not going to be able to say the same things as people that are outside the organization, and pushing back. So you can use social media and mainstream media very effectively. Organizations don't like to have the spotlight shined on them that there's a problem within the organization. So people outside the organization can do a great job by knowing what's happening within, but also pushing from outside and ensuring that there's enough pressure on, administration and leaders, politicians, that they actually institute real change, rather than what often happens is like window dressing, or tokenism. We want to be careful that we're seeing like the real changes that need to happen.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it to Terry Sleva. I see you have your hand up. If you'd unmute, you can pose your question.
Hi, thanks. A lot of the question got answered. But when you mentioned that Canada is moving towards understanding, I really a red flag. How? Could you give me an example in somewhere where we could actually do something?
Yeah, no, thank you for your question. As I mentioned before, that and again, it's possible that people on the ground may not feel it, and I can fully understand, as I said before, that we haven't solved so many problems. But if you look at what has happened at all the three levels of the government, there is a progress that's made. Whether it's about freedom of speech, whether it's about, we're talking about the way people can live, whether they can live or sort of put the tent in a public park, in a public building, public institution. They can, because Canadian judiciary has said so. I mentioned about Ontario. Ontario's some of the very radical policy legislative changes have occurred. Again, these are all things that have happened in only last 6-7 years. So, a common Canadian perhaps doesn't feel it at that point of time, but I think Canada is on right trajectory. I think that's what I should say, as opposed to some of the other countries around the world, if that's the comparison we want to take.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Al Kostanek. Al, you have your hand up. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. Your screen froze up at the exact moment you were saying my name, and I know there's another Al on the call. So I thought, oh boy. Yeah, I wanted to say, well, just to introduce my question, what a profound event this has turned out to be. I got on because I'm interested in the topic, but I had no idea it was going to be so deep. Like, very impressive. But my question is related to Sandeep's presentation. He said that the importance of government. This is a paraphrase. If the government's going to solve the problem, they have to sort of work at the three levels and coordinate at three levels, which, having worked with government and for government over the years and having worked in nonprofits, that seems like the likelihood of seeing pigs fly by my window just now. It's a very hard thing. It's a very, very challenging thing. So here's the question. What, in Sandeep or any of the other presenters' opinion, is the best placed organization or organizations to have a coordinated, or you could say integrated, response? We have all these problems that need to be solved, and honestly, there's big money behind certain kinds of opinions trying to keep fair and equitable things from happening. So what is our best chance of making the kind of headway that we'd all like to see? If the question's too vague, I could come up with a rephrasing, I guess. But that's my question. Which team should we back?
Thanks for the question. I'll just make a very quick comment because it seems like the question was directed to me. If we want to make a legal change, if we want to go to the government and say, these are my rights, I think we as individuals, as non-governmental organizations, I think we need to go to the Human Rights Tribunal, Human Rights Commission. We need to go to the courts and have access to our rights. I think that would be my sort of way of looking at it.
Alicia or Sheelah, do you have any thoughts about that?
I think the biggest thing is how do we change our attitudes in ourselves, and then we also need to look at what our policies are. So, I mean, we're talking about government, but we're also talking about policies within organizations. We have small forms of governments in organizations. We have boards, we have committees. Like there are processes in place. There's leaderships being developed. So being able to change at the levels that we have more control over will help push the larger levels moving forward. So there are always opportunities to have new voices on boards, to have new space. If you don't have, and I'm not saying to tokenize at all, but if you don't have space for Indigenous women, for newcomers, for anybody, to us LGBTQ plus, that's already an issue. So how do we make space? How do we create those things? And again, do not tokenize. It's not a checkbox. It's another way of engaging. What does that actually look like? And how are you doing the work behind it? Because it is a lot of work.
Thank you. Yeah, that actually leads into another question I have, but I know we have more questions, so I'm not going to go to mine. Sheelah, did you want to respond, or should I? Okay,
I would just say, I would just say that is a big question. And I think it's really contextual, that there isn't one blanket answer for how to respond. And I think that it very much depends on what the organization or institution is, who's involved, what people's comfort level are, and then what strategies would work best in that moment.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's always thinking and learning, and very much about talking to people, right? Very much about engaging and building relationships and working through it, trying things out, right? Larry, you've had your hand up for a little while.
Yeah, I just want to know, what was the reasoning behind the elimination of the Human Rights Tribunal? I think Saskatchewan originally had one before, didn't we?
is there anyone here from the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission? Because I actually, I knew that there had been changes made, but I don't think I quite realized that you had to go through regular court now. Is there support from the Human Rights Commission to go through regular court if you have a human rights complaint, or do they only do mediation?
Rhonda, that was my comment, Terry here.
Okay, Terry, do you have more information?
I sure do.
Go for
when
it.
David Arnott was chief commissioner, a fellow by the name of Tim Wise, a anti-racist advocate from the States, was in Regina, and I was at every one of his presentations. But in the end, it was at First Nations University. And this was about the year 2014. And I went up to the podium or to the microphone, and I said, David, could you tell me why David Arnott, Chief Secretary General of Amnesty International, came to Regina warning us about what's being dismantled? David, can you tell me why the tribunal is going to be addressed just by you? David, can you tell me why women, it's not 2 years anymore, but people are given 1 year for a sexual assault? And why is it being held in the criminal courts now? As was mentioned earlier, you have to pay. And he looked over at Tim Wise and he said, I thought we were here for racism, not human rights. Welcome to Saskatchewan. Yeah. Didn't answer much, but yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. And maybe kind of in the context of us sending some stuff out, we might look for some things about what is accessible through the Human Rights Commission and what is not. And there may be some need to question what's offered. Janelle.
Thanks, Rhonda. I'm just remembering, like, further to this conversation, just remembering in the RLIP's recent community forum on erasing racism, which you were part of as well. The bit that was presented there about discrimination incidents going to the Human Rights Commission, and the piece where it was presented that many of the cases in Saskatchewan, many of the incidents in Saskatchewan are actually getting resolved through like their dispute resolution process before having to go to the legal courts. So I can't remember the exact percentage, but just remembering that was presented in that context. And it seems that there are quite a number that are resolved before they get to the court system. However, I'm certainly not in any position to, say whether that's enough or, there's so much more work to be done. But yeah, that's one little bit of info that I came across recently in that context.
Thanks, Janelle. And unbelievably, I think we're at the end of our time. This is 2 hours that has really flown by in my afternoon. I'm guessing it feels like that for many of us. What I am super excited about is the numbers of people who are interested. And we had even more people who are not able to attend at this time, but want to be connected to this. And so the capacity for us with the Anti-Racism Network, to be able to send you out additional information from this event, but also about other things that are going on, I think will keep the network and the collaboration and perhaps community of practice, as was suggested both by Sheelah and in the chat, continuing. Is really exciting and very interesting. And I really want to thank Sheelah and Alicia and Sandeep, for bringing your knowledge and your experience and your stories to us. And Sandeep, especially for bringing that national and Alberta neighbor perspective, as well as our Saskatchewan perspective. That this has really been a very meaningful opportunity for learning, and one that I hope will continue. I'm going to share just super quickly to get us back here. You can go on our website. We have resources that you can download, but I wanted to point out, Sandeep shared the cover of his book that will be coming out soon. Sheelah also has a book coming out that is edited by her, and I'm sure many of us know Verna St. Dennis and Amanda Gebhardt. So these are a couple more resources that, if you're interested in furthering your learning, would be excellent places to go. Lisa has shared in the chat, and perhaps we'll share again for those who might have missed it, a link to an evaluation. Please, please, please fill it out. It's really valuable for us. Also valuable for us to share comments with the presenters and with our funders, of course. So we're very grateful for their support so that we can continue to do the work that we are doing. But Sask Lotteries, Sask Culture, Ministry of Parks, Culture and Sport, and Canadian Heritage. And with that, I will say good afternoon to everybody, and have a really good rest of your day.
And Rhonda, I just highlight, I did put the links to the books in the chat, as well as the evaluation, as well as my email address, should anyone try to contact me.
Wonderful. And we can email all those things out too.
Yes.